At 3 a.m., the Denmark Strait. To the Russian captain of the Yasen-M nuclear submarine, this looks like the perfect crime. He is sitting in the acoustic blind spot of a U.S. carrier strike group, navigating the freezing waters of the Arctic. He has a Zircon hypersonic missile capable of sinking the USS Gerald R. Ford in exactly 4 minutes. He believes he is the hunter. But 200 miles away, inside a hollowed-out glacier in Greenland, a U.S. operator has been watching him for the last 3 days. The Russian captain isn't a hunter, he is a data point in a simulation that was solved before his engines even ignited. Welcome to the reality of modern naval warfare, where the ocean is made of glass and silence is just a myth. We're looking at a scenario that keeps admirals awake at night, the closing of the Iron Door. This narrow stretch of water between Greenland, Iceland, and the UK isn't just a patrol route. It is the IKEA highway, the primary artery for the free world, carrying everything from Swedish furniture to American trucks. If Moscow can slam this door shut, the global economy is strangled in a heartbeat. That is why the stakes here are not just about a single ship sinking, it is about the collapse of the Western supply chain. To the frustration of many observers looking at the map, it seems reckless to send a $13 billion asset like the USS Ford into this frozen graveyard. It looks like a suicide mission to leave it unescorted against quiet diesel submarines and hypersonic missiles. But this is the first lesson of the new era of combat. The carrier is not the target, it is the bait. The Russian Northern Fleet believes they are sneaking past a distracted sentry, but they are actually swimming in a digital aquarium we built in the 1960s. This is the legacy of Project Iceworm, a top-secret Cold War operation where Washington carved nuclear-hardened listening posts directly into the Greenland ice shelf. While the Russian captain checks his sonar and sees empty water, the Thule radar net is tracking his exact position with surgical precision, beaming that data directly to the U.S. command. Let's watch the trap spring. At 3 p.m., a bone-chilling screech shatters the Arctic silence as a Russian Type 53 torpedo rips through the water, locked onto the heart of the supercarrier. This is the aggression phase. The Russian doctrine is simple: overwhelm the target with kinetic force. At 45 knots, the torpedo gives the American fleet exactly 5 minutes before the pride of the Navy becomes a titanium coffin. On the surface, the response from the U.S. Navy looks like panic. The Arleigh Burke-class destroyers in the escort screen immediately deploy Nixie acoustic lures. These are digital sirens that mimic the massive turbine signature of the aircraft carrier, dragging the torpedo away from the real ship and into the void. Simultaneously, they launch a lightweight interceptor, turning the Russian weapon into a cloud of bubbles and shrapnel. It looks like a textbook defense, a close shave. But inside the Combat Information Center of the U.S. destroyer, the mood is not one of relief, it is one of suspicion. Why was the shot so exposed? In a high-stakes game of naval chess, if your opponent makes a move this stupid, it is because he is setting up the real execution. The torpedo was just a diagnostic tool. By forcing the American fleet to defend itself, Moscow forced them to light up their radars, revealing their exact frequency signatures. This is the moment the frustrated beginner needs to understand. Modern war isn't about blowing things up, it is about the electromagnetic spectrum. The Russians fired that torpedo to make the Americans turn on their flashlights so they could see exactly where to aim the next punch. And that punch arrives at 3 p.m. Suddenly, the billion-dollar Aegis combat system, the brain of the U.S. fleet, designed to track thousands of targets, simultaneously goes blind. The screens turn to flickering white static. This is a spectral blackout. The Russian destroyer has activated a high-power electronic warfare system, creating a digital black hole that effectively lobotomizes the American situational awareness. To make matters worse, the threat escalates vertically. High above the cloud layer at 52,000 feet, two Russian Tu-160 White Swan bombers are screaming toward the fleet at Mach 1.8. They're conducting what is known as a public roar. They have turned off their transponders and are banking on the chaotic terrain of the Arctic to hide their approach. They believe they're the undisputed kings of speed. This is where the frustration of the average viewer usually peaks. We spent billions on stealth technology and satellites, yet we seem to be blind, jammed, and outrun by 1970s-era Russian technology. But this is where the counter-narrative begins. The U.S. Navy didn't lose the signal, they just stopped broadcasting it. While the Russian pilots are gloating over their speed, believing they have vanished into the stratospheric void, they are making a fatal strategic error. Speed doesn't matter if you're already a variable in someone else's equation. High above the atmosphere, U.S. early warning satellites are tracking the thermal plumes of their engines with surgical precision. The U.S. response is not to light up more radar, which would just give the Russians more data. Instead, they switch to the high intercept. Two F-15EX Eagle IIs, the most heavily armed interceptors in the American arsenal, are already loitering at 60,000 feet. They're sitting at the very edge of space, looking down on the Russian bombers. Here is the key technology that changes everything. The F-15s are not using active radar. They're using the EPAWS electronic warfare suite to create a corridor of silence. They're listening to the Russian jets' own emissions using the enemy's own radar waves to build a 3D targeting solution. It is a masterclass in predatory geometry. The Russians are literally providing the illumination for their own funeral. At 9:25 a.m., a calm American voice cuts through the static on the International Guard frequency. Russian aircraft, your tactical geometry is solved. You are currently positioned within the saturation net of 96 launch tubes. State your intentions. This is the concept of the silent kill. The Russians brought missiles to a data fight. The White Swans attempt a final desperate move, opening their bomb bays to threaten a launch. In a traditional war, this would be the start of World War III. But the U.S. response is instant and non-kinetic. The Arleigh Burke destroyer below unleashes a spectral surge. This isn't a missile. It is a concentrated beam of directed energy focused on the specific microscopic frequency that controls the bomb bay door actuators. It is a surgical digital lobotomy. The Russian pilots press the manual override, but the doors are no longer listening to them. They are caught in a loop of vibrating steel and digital white noise. The giant has its mouth open, but the U.S. Navy has just wired its jaw shut. Meanwhile, back on the surface, the Russian submarine captain, who thought he was the hunter, receives his own reality check. He thinks the U.S. fleet is still blinded by the jamming. But he forgot about the eyes of the ice. The Thule radar data has been beamed directly to a Virginia-class attack submarine, the USS Colorado, which has been ghosting the Russian sub for 48 hours. The Colorado maneuvers into the Russians' acoustic shadow and unleashes a single active ping. The sound hits the Russian hull so hard it echoes through their command deck like a hammer hitting a bell. This is a digital execution notice. Before the Russian captain can even cycle his torpedo doors, the American sub has a firing solution on his reactor room. At 3:17 p.m., signal exploitation phase. As the Yasen-M initiates an evasive dive, it activates the MGK 600 Tritium Forest sonar suite at elevated output power. The transmission propagates through the layered Arctic water column, interacting with thermocline gradients and seabed reflectivity. The emitted waveform is captured by distributed seabed hydrophone arrays integrated into a modernized Atlantic undersea surveillance architecture. The signal is processed using wideband spectral decomposition. Harmonic sidebands generated by reactor coolant pumps, turbine shaft rotation, and pump jet cavitation patterns are isolated. These mechanical signatures create repeatable frequency fingerprints unique to hull configuration and propulsion state. Within sub-second processing time, the contact is upgraded from class-level identification to hull-specific acoustic profile match. The submarine's acoustic identity is now confirmed and continuously tracked. AP-8A Poseidon, operating at 30,000 feet, adjusts its orbit and deploys a calibrated multi-static sonobuoy field. The buoys are positioned to measure Doppler shift variation and refine velocity vectors rather than to conduct wide-area search. Data packets are transmitted via satellite relay and integrated into fleet command systems through secure network nodes. The result is a high-fidelity, continuously updated three-dimensional movement model of the submarine. including estimated maneuver envelope and propulsion load status. At 3:21 p.m., the Tu-160 aircraft transitioned to lower altitude terrain following flight in an attempt to exploit sea surface clutter and reduce conventional radar detection probability. However, high-frequency, over-the-horizon backscatter radar systems operating across the North Atlantic detect ionospheric disturbances generated by large, moving, conductive objects. The aircraft's passage produces measurable variations in upper atmospheric electron density. These perturbations allow vector estimation independent of line-of-sight radar. The tracks are fused with satellite infrared data detecting engine plume heat signatures. Updated vectors are transmitted through Link 16 to airborne F-15EX aircraft maintaining high-altitude loiter. The F-15EX platforms operate in passive detection mode using a pause to monitor emissions from onboard bomber systems. Tu-160 engagement envelopes are calculated, but no active radar illumination or missile launch occurs. Kinetic engagement is not required to maintain airspace control geometry. 3:26 p.m. Within the Yasen-M, minor variance appears in reactor coolant monitoring instrumentation. The deviation is small but sufficient to trigger verification procedures. During the earlier electromagnetic exchange, narrowband signal probes collected telemetry timing patterns from Russian electronic systems. The interaction does not constitute direct control intrusion. However, injected diagnostic noise within peripheral monitoring channels increases uncertainty in sensor interpretation. Engineering personnel initiate internal cross-check protocols. Operational tempo reduces while instrumentation discrepancies are resolved. The submarine decreases propulsion output during verification. A reduction of 3 knots materially alters intercept modeling. The USS Colorado recalculates firing solution parameters for the Mk-48 ADCAP torpedo using updated speed and depth inputs. Probability of kill modeling exceeds 0.95 under current geometry. The weapon remains in the tube. Instead of launch, a controlled active acoustic transmission is emitted. The pulse confirms fire control, lock status, and communicates presence without escalation. Russian tactical displays register inbound solution tracking parameters consistent with active targeting. No weapon discharges. Engagement objective shifts from destruction to capability demonstration and signature collection. Before the Russian submarine can fully disengage, a secondary layer of the American undersea network activates. At 3:28 p.m., a dormant seabed node integrated into the updated Atlantic SOSUS grid initiates low probability of intercept acoustic sampling. Unlike traditional hydrophone arrays, this node employs adaptive beamforming algorithms that dynamically compensate for Arctic thermocline distortion and multipath propagation interference. The result is not just detection, it is volumetric mapping. For a brief window of 11 seconds, the Yasen-M's pump jet modulation frequency fluctuates as internal ballast compensation adjusts during the evasive dive. That microvariance, only 0.7 Hz, is captured. Inside Fleet Command, machine learning filters trained on decades of Soviet and post-Soviet propulsion data immediately flag a pattern anomaly. The acoustic deviation correlates with partial load redistribution inside the pressure hull, likely torpedo room reconfiguration under stress. The Americans now know not only where the submarine is, they know what it is doing internally. Simultaneously, in low Earth orbit, a next-generation infrared reconnaissance satellite refines plume analysis from the Tu-160 engines. Spectral separation isolates combustion inefficiency patterns, suggesting afterburner cycling to compensate for cold air density shifts. That thermal inefficiency slightly increases radar cross-section due to ionized exhaust interaction. The F-15EX crews receive a silent update through secure link. 16 burst transmission. No chatter. No warnings. Just geometry tightening. One Eagle driver briefly toggles his helmet display into predictive intercept visualization mode. A thin red arc appears, not as a missile path, but as a probability corridor. If engagement were authorized, the Tu-160 time to impact would be 74 seconds. The Russians never know how close that number was. At 3:31 p.m., the Tu-160 formation executes a banking turn toward Murmansk airspace. The submarine reduces depth change rate and stabilizes at low acoustic output. From the outside, it looks like disengagement. From the American side, it is confirmation. Full spectrum electronic capture continues for another 90 seconds, long enough to extract modulation harmonics from Russian electronic warfare emitters operating in fallback diagnostic mode. Then silence. Not the silence of retreat, the silence of ownership. The question you might be asking is, why didn't we sink them? Why let the submarine dive away and the bombers turn back to Murmansk? Why allow this aggression to go unpunished? This is the gap in understanding that most people miss. Sinking a ship turns it into scrap metal. A dead ship tells no tales. But a humiliated ship that returns home brings back a virus of fear. More importantly, the real prize wasn't the destruction of the enemy, it was the data. During those few minutes of conflict, the U.S. Navy harvested petabytes of electronic signatures and jammer frequencies. Moscow thinks they escaped, but they actually just paid billions of dollars to hand over their most sensitive electronic DNA for free. This engagement wasn't just a battle, it was a stress test for the U.S. Navy's digital twin wargaming engines. We don't just train with targets, anymore we train with data. The ice-cold precision of the Thule radar net and our seamless cloud-based architecture form an invisible wall that ensures the global economy remains open. So the next time you see a headline about a Russian ship getting close to a U.S. carrier or a bomber flying near Alaska, do not assume the U.S. Navy was caught off guard. In the 21st century, if you can't see the U.S. Navy, it is not because they aren't there. It is because they have already hacked your eyes. The board was solved before the engines even ignited.